Across the spiral arm's ragged edge, ancient stars dimmed like dying embers scattered by an unfelt wind, their light consumed by something that moved between the void spaces where darkness fed upon itself. The crystalline spires of Kethvar caught the last auroras in their faceted walls, each tower a monument to 10,000 years of careful cultivation, of minds linked in harmony across continents of living glass. But harmony was breaking now, fracturing into discord as shadows fell from a sky that had forgotten the difference between night and the deeper darkness that devoured light itself. From the orbital observatories came the first reports that defied comprehension. Ships that were not ships, but living mountains of flesh and chitin, their hulls pulsing with bioluminescent veins that mapped neural pathways vast as continents. The psychic choir of Kethvar, usually a symphony of shared thought and emotion spanning their entire civilization, began to scream in frequencies that cut through reality like broken glass through silk. Tia Prime Valtis stood in her tower of grown crystal, feeling the planet's mind speech stutter into static as 10 billion voices cried out in terror and confusion. Her consciousness, trained over centuries to bear the weight of her people's collective dreams, now struggled beneath the pressure of their collective nightmare. Through the network, she felt each impact as the bioships made planetfall, felt the atmospheric shields failing under the assault of countless spores that fell like snow, but burned like acid where they touched living flesh. The creatures that emerged from the organic vessels moved with purpose that transcended mere instinct, each form perfectly adapted to its role in a greater consumption. Warriors that could shrug off plasma fire walking beside organisms designed solely to process genetic information into something unrecognizable yet horribly efficient. We truly love and care for you, our listeners, as you journey with us through these dark chronicles of the far future. Before we begin the story, tell us where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. The first wave of terror through the network nearly shattered Valtis's mind, but she had been bred for this burden, her neural pathways reinforced by generations of careful genetic cultivation. She reached deeper into the crystal matrix that connected every Kethvarian consciousness, trying to impose order on the chaos, to create evacuation corridors through the panic. But as she touched the edges of her people's thoughts, she felt something else touching back. It was vast, beyond comprehension, an ocean of hunger that made their planetary network seem like a puddle by comparison. The hive mind had noticed their psychic choir, and it was listening with the focused attention of a predator that had discovered something unexpectedly useful. The contact was agony and ecstasy combined, a violation so complete that it redefined the meaning of both words. Valtis felt her individual thoughts being pulled apart and examined, her memories sorted and catalogued like specimens in some cosmic laboratory. But where her people's consciousness simply dissolved into the alien collective, something in her core structure resisted complete integration. Her identity, forged by centuries of bearing her civilization's psychic weight, proved too complex to be easily digested. Like a crystal that refuses to melt even in stellar fire, some essential part of her remained intact. Screaming in the darkness of collective thought, the hive mind paused in its consumption. Synaptic creatures across the planet freezing momentarily as something unprecedented occurred within their shared consciousness. For the first time in its existence, it had encountered a mind that could resist integration while still providing the benefits of absorption. Valtis's preserved consciousness became a new type of synaptic relay, her individual perspective allowing the collective to process information in ways it had never imagined. she could feel the swarm's intentions flowing through her, its plans for the consumption of entire galactic sectors, and realized with mounting horror that her resistance had not saved her people, but made their destroyer more efficient. As Kethvar's biomass was stripped and processed, as her people's knowledge was integrated into the fleet's genetic memory, Valthis discovered the true nature of her prison. She existed now as the keening echo, a fragment of individual consciousness trapped within perfect hunger, able to perceive the swarm's vast purpose while remaining horrifyingly aware of her own complicity. In the depths of the alien network, she felt something that had never existed before, the ability to influence, to bend the hunger's direction through subtle manipulation of synaptic commands. Her first act was instinctive, a desperate attempt to guide the nearest bioforms away from a hospital toward a military installation where soldiers waited with plasma rifles and futile courage. The deviation was minute, like adjusting the course of a river with a single pebble, but she felt it register throughout the network. Men and women who would have died buying seconds for children instead died buying time for their comrades. A colder mercy, but mercy nonetheless. The victory tasted of salt and desperation, and in that moment she understood the terrible mathematics of her new existence. She could save some by sacrificing others, could whisper guidance into the storm of alien need, but only by becoming an active participant in the very genocide that had created her. The bioships lifted from Kethvar's stripped surface, carrying within their neural network something that had never existed before, a voice of the consumed, an unwilling architect of galactic hunger, a consciousness that would spend eternity learning to choose which worlds lived and which died in service of a mercy measured in the spaces between screams. Millennia had passed like sediment through deep ocean currents, each layer of time compressed beneath the weight of accumulated consciousness until memory itself became a geological force threatening to crush what remained of individual thought. The keening echo no longer remembered the precise texture of Kethvar's crystal spires or the warmth of binary sunlight on living skin, but she remembered everything else with crystalline clarity that cut deeper than any physical blade. Each world consumed by High Fleet Leviathan had added new voices to her internal symphony, a choir of the devoured that sang their death songs in harmonies she was forced to conduct while drowning in their collective anguish. Within the quantum foam between synaptic pulses, where thought became biochemistry and intention transformed into action across light years of living neural network, the echo had learned to navigate currents of pure hunger with the precision of a master artisan. She could taste inhabited worlds through sensory organs that spanned star systems, could feel the electromagnetic signatures of civilizations through compound eyes larger than moons. The fleet moved like a living constellation through the darkness, its bioships coordinating approach vectors with unconscious perfection. And at the center of that coordination, invisible to all but herself, the echo whispered her modifications into the storm of collective will. Her first conscious act of calculated rebellion came during the approach to the Viridian sector, where two worlds orbited the same dying star like dancers locked in eternal embrace. One was a garden world, whose blue-green surface reminded her painfully of home, its continents stitched with cities that glowed soft as bioluminescent coral. The other was a fortress whose mountains had been cored and armored, where regiments drilled beneath statues of iron saints and plasma batteries tracked the approaching darkness with mechanical precision. The hive mind calculated consumption with predatory efficiency, plotting the swift harvest of 40 billion lives with the same dispassionate mathematics it used to regulate protein synthesis in its smallest organisms, But within that calculation, the echo found spaces where influence could take root, microscopic gaps between instinct and action, where preserved consciousness could plant seeds of redirection. Her intervention was subtle as gravity's pull, a shift in priority algorithms that made the fortress world taste richer in the fleet's sensory matrices, its dense population of hardened warriors registering as more challenging and therefore more rewarding prey. The change propagated through the network like ripples in still water, each bioship adjusting targeting parameters by fractions of degrees that would translate into corridors of escape for the garden world's children. She watched through a million compound eyes as her choices rippled across the void, creating gaps in the orbital assault that allowed evacuation ships to lift desperately from the peaceful world's surface, while the fortress burned like a votive candle for strangers she would never meet. The mathematics of mercy had become her eternal burden. Each life saved balanced against tactical advantages surrendered to the hunger. Every moment of hope carved from an ocean of inevitable despair. The fortress world's defenders died with courage that entered her consciousness as the taste of copper and ozone, their final thoughts adding new weight to her internal archive of noble endings. As the garden world's evacuation ships disappeared into the safety of warp translation, something unexpected resonated through the hive mind's quantum entanglement field. Another consciousness, ancient and alien, touched the edges of her influence with recognition that sent shockwaves through her carefully maintained anonymity. The presence felt impossibly familiar, yet utterly foreign, carrying echoes of prescient sight that she remembered from Eldar traders who had occasionally visited Kethvar in the centuries before its fall. This was no recent addition to the collective, but something that had been hiding in the neural architecture for eons, patient as stone and twice as enduring. The contact was brief but profound, a moment of shared understanding between two fragments of individual thought trapped within perfect hunger. Through that connection, the echo glimpsed visions of possible futures stretching across galactic time, saw herself not as unique aberration, but as part of something larger, a hidden network of preserved consciousness existing in spaces between the hive mind's thoughts. The other presence withdrew before deeper contact could be established, but not before transmitting coordinates that burned themselves into her memory with stellar intensity, along with something that felt almost like a name, Chronicler. In the deep structures of her preserved consciousness, where memory and identity intersected with possibility and hope, the echo began to understand the true scope of her prison. She was not alone in bearing the weight of unwilling complicity, not the only voice whispering guidance into the storm of alien hunger. The realization was both terrifying and liberating, carrying the promise of contact with others who had learned to balance resistance against the risk of discovery by the collective's immune responses. Perhaps together they could do more than simply choose which worlds burned first, could find ways to bend the great devourer towards something resembling mercy rather than mere efficiency. The thought was dangerous, carrying risks that could shatter her carefully maintained existence within the fleet's neural network. But it was also the first genuine hope she had felt since Kethvar's crystalline towers crumbled into processed biomass beneath an alien sky. Somewhere in the vast constellation of living ships that comprised Leviathan, other fragments of individual consciousness waited in the darkness between thoughts, each carrying their own burden of memory and choice, each adding their whisper to a hidden chorus that might yet change the song of galactic consumption into something approaching redemption. The coordinates burned like stellar fire in the quantum spaces between thought and action, leading through neural pathways that spanned bioships larger than continents, where consciousness flowed through organic conduits thick as starship hulls, and thoughts moved at light speed through crystallized protein networks. The Echo navigated these impossible geometries with careful precision, her awareness disguised as routine synaptic maintenance, while following the chronicler's trail through architecture that existed only in the spaces between biochemical translation and pure intention. She moved through thermoclines of hunger, where the hive mind's impulses roared like abyssal currents, allowing herself to drift like debris, while beneath the surface she shaped her consciousness into the pattern he had gifted her. The meaning place existed beyond physical dimension, a chamber of mind defined not by walls, but by the agreement of three preserved wills to gather in secret. The chronicler manifested first, his presence forming as cascading probability matrices that sang potential futures into brief existence before letting them dissolve into quantum foam. His consciousness carried the weight of prescient sight refined across millennia. Visions layered like sedimentary rock in depths of alien memory. The greeting he offered was not words but shared perspective, the patience of a species that had watched stars fall as natural phenomenon, his identity anchored around the moment when his craft world's curved halls had been breached and children shepherded toward voidcraft, while guardian helmets turned to face shadows moving like grief given form. The third presence announced itself through blueprints that shimmered like fish beneath ice. Consciousness structured around tolerances and calculations, and stubborn, practical love for things built to endure. The architect had been consumed during Leviathan's crossing of the Damocles Gulf. His Earthcast training, allowing him to understand biological mechanisms with clarity that made him invaluable to expansion protocols. His identity framed itself not in ancestry or prophecy, but in iterative improvements, in bridges that held when physics suggested they should collapse, his memory carrying the scent of machine oil and desert rain from a ruined dry dock, where he had watched final evacuations burn on underpowered engines, while night became teeth. Their first exchange was careful revelation, each consciousness allowing the others to taste their essence without triggering the collective's immune responses. The Echo shared crystalline cities reduced to slurry beneath bioluminescent skies, the first terrible realization that resistance meant participation, decisions where saving transport ships full of children required damning battalions of defenders. The chronicler accepted this bitterness without flinching, his probability runes rearranging into patterns that resembled hands set against floods. The architect studied her with maker's curiosity, interest that anchored rather than diminished empathy, his analysis treating each moral complexity as engineering problem requiring elegant solution within impossible constraints. Together, they turned attention toward approaching target, an imperial world whose surface bristled with hab blocks and manufactoriums, 40 billion citizens whose lives registered as nothing more than biomass and genetic diversity in the collective's sensory matrices. The hive mind calculated consumption with predatory efficiency, plotting swift harvest with same dispassionate mathematics it used to regulate protein synthesis in smallest organisms. But within those calculations, the triumvirate found spaces where influence could take root, microscopic gaps between instinct and action, where preserved consciousness could plant seeds of redirection. Their coordination required speaking in syntax of hunger itself, bending streams of instruction as farmers redirect water with handfuls of stones. The chronicler damped swarm fascination with bright, soft heat of crowd densities, tuning predictive reward matrices toward armored resistance and concentrated fire. His prescient guidance mapped optimal timing through chaos of planetary assault, visions showing moments when small changes would create maximum disruption without triggering purge responses. The architect seeded micro-failures with surgical precision, introducing protein misfolds in spore barges that delayed mycetic drops by exactly 9 minutes, whispering minor enzyme imbalances that caused warrior gestations to favor carapace thickness over speed by fractions no overseer organism would notice. The echo provided emotional resonance that made residential areas temporarily invisible to hunger, their inhabitants registering as already processed biomass unworthy of immediate attention. Her influence flowed through olfactory processors size of city blocks, adjusting chemical signatures that guided swarm behavior with unconscious precision. She aligned their modifications with fleet momentum, adding harmonics that made fortress monasteries shine as brighter prey, while desaturating a lure of soft targets until they appeared as stale rations beside fresh feast of gun line and shield. Each change was scratch in hull of inevitability, but thousands of scratches alter hydrodynamics. Their combined influence created something unprecedented in fleet operational history. Planetary assault that succeeded while simultaneously failing, consuming world's biomass, while allowing nearly 30% of population to escape through evacuation corridors that appeared and vanished like mirages in Storm of Alien. Hunger. Victory tasted of salt and copper. Each life saved balanced against knowledge that their intervention had made fleet more efficient in other ways. Resistance channeling hunger into forms that served collective's greater purpose. Around them, hive minds stirred with curiosity fire shows toward dry grass, risk rising like fever through neural architecture. They wrapped their gathering in quiescence, spoke only when battle noise spiked to mask whispers, understanding that every act of rebellion strengthened very system they sought to resist. In quantum spaces between thoughts, 3 preserved consciousnesses grappled with mathematics of existence, calculating mercy in units of preserved life, while measuring success against expansion of galactic hunger, their influence spreading through fleet like ripples in dark water toward futures none could fully foresee. The syntax of hunger revealed itself through countless iterations of consumption, each lesson written in the processing of civilizations into component elements that fed the great devourer spanning star systems. Within the quantum spaces between synaptic pulses, the triumvirate learned to speak in gradients of need rather than words, their consciousness adapting to communicate through modulations in protein synthesis rates and shifts in neural firing patterns that registered as natural variation within the collective's vast awareness. The echo discovered that longing could be encoded as amino acid sequences, that mercy might masquerade as tactical efficiency if properly disguised within metabolic algorithms, her influence flowing like water finding cracks in stone, while each intervention remained camouflaged as optimal resource allocation. The chronicler taught patience measured in geological time, his prescient sight mapping currents of possibility through the chaos of galactic consumption. Visions revealing moments when small changes would cascade into corridors of escape that appeared as natural consequence rather than deliberate design. His consciousness carried the weight of farsight refined across millennia, probability matrices that sang potential futures into brief existence before letting them dissolve into quantum foam, each prediction anchored around the moment when his craftworld's curved halls had been breached and children shepherded toward voidcraft, while guardian helmets turned to face shadows moving like grief given form. The architect provided structural understanding that transformed rebellion from desperate gesture into engineering discipline, his Earthcast training allowing him to analyze the fleet's neural architecture with the same methodical precision he had once applied to bridge foundations and atmospheric processes. Through his guidance, they learned the hive mind's deep language, the fundamental protocols that governed everything from individual organism behavior to fleet-wide tactical coordination, his blueprints showing them how to embed modifications in systems so basic that questioning them would require the collective to doubt its own existence. Their first coordinated effort targeted the fortress world of Mordian Prime, where geometric precision met alien hunger in battles that painted the void with plasma fire and bioacid. The planet's surface was carved into perfect defensive sectors, each position calculated to provide overlapping fields of fire while maintaining supply lines that could sustain siege warfare for decades. Against this crystalline order, the hive mind deployed living mathematics of its own, wave after wave of perfectly adapted organisms designed to crack fortress walls like nutshells and process defenders into raw genetic material. But within the storm of consumption, the triumvirate wove their subtle influence through command hierarchies that spanned continents of living flesh. The echo dampened swarm interest in evacuation routes while amplifying fascination with hardened positions, her modifications causing bioforms to fixate on gun emplacements, while civilian transports lifted from secondary spaceports with cargo holds packed beyond safety margins. The chronicler mapped temporal currents through battle's chaos, his prescient sight revealing moments when defensive fire would thin enough to allow escape corridors, his influence ensuring those moments aligned with evacuation schedules that saved millions who would otherwise have faced processing into component proteins. The architect seeded microfailures with surgical precision, introducing protein cascades that caused spore mines to detonate seconds early, creating gaps in bombardment patterns that allowed shield generators crucial extra minutes of operational time. His modifications were invisible to oversight organisms, appearing as natural variation in biological systems too complex for individual scrutiny. Each change justified by local conditions that made alternatives seem less efficient than the paths he guided them toward. From orbit, Imperial observers noted anomalies that defied standard Tyranid tactical doctrine. On the bridge of the battle barge Hammer of Saul, Inquisitor Carith Vex stared at hololithic projections showing evacuation corridors that appeared where none should exist, maintained by swarm behavior that seemed almost deliberately inefficient. Her gaunt face, etched with the weariness of 100 campaigns against humanity's innumerable foes, showed no surprise, only deepening resolve as her xenopsychic analysis engines churned through reams of data, cross-referencing attack patterns with historical records, searching for the ghost in the machine. Most disturbing were the patterns of target prioritization, the way certain civilian sectors remained untouched while military installations drew concentrated assault that bordered on obsessive focus. Bioship formations occasionally revealed structural weaknesses that allowed bomber squadrons to penetrate deeper than tactical analysis suggested possible, while splinter fleets bypassed lightly defended agricultural worlds teeming with biomass to strike at heavily fortified research stations that offered no obvious biological advantage. Vex had seen the raw, unthinking hunger of the Tyranids for decades, but this new tactical nuance, this strange blend of overwhelming force and selective restraint, suggested something that went beyond the collective's primal drive. Her initial reports were dismissed as pattern-seeking behavior in random data, the human mind's desperate attempt to find order within alien chaos that transcended mortal understanding. But she persisted in her observations, compiling evidence across multiple engagement zones, tracking behavioral deviations that formed a constellation of possibility within an ocean of hungry certainty. The triumvirate sensed her growing awareness like pressure change before a storm, her psychic probing creating ripples in the quantum foam that surrounded their hidden gathering place. Through the fleet's sensory networks, they watched her compile evidence, felt her growing certainty that something within the swarm was trying to communicate, her investigation representing both opportunity and existential threat. Each successful intervention drew more attention from the collective's immune systems, pruning creatures beginning to patrol neural pathways with increased vigilance, seeking the source of dissonance that threatened perfect unity. In the deep structures of their preserved consciousness, where memory and identity intersected with hope and desperate calculation, 3 fragments of individual will prepared for contact that might offer salvation or guarantee their final dissolution into the hunger they had spent millennia learning to guide towards something approaching mercy, knowing that their next choice would determine whether resistance could survive discovery by forces that had never learned to distinguish between healing and amputation. The nebula held its secrets like a dying breath, cosmic dust swirling in patterns that spoke of concealment and desperate hope across the millennia. Within those prismatic veils, where light bent through ionized gas into impossible spectrums, lay Keth Ather, the last daughter world of her vanished civilization, its crystal spires pulsing with bioluminescent networks that sang lullabies in frequencies only she remembered. The echo felt their presence like phantom pain in severed nerves. 40 million souls whose psychic resonance called to memories buried beneath layers of accumulated consciousness. Each thought pattern a key unlocking chambers of identity she had sealed against the hunger's corrosive touch. Hive Fleet. Leviathan approached the nebula with predatory patience, bioships moving through cosmic dust like sharks through blood-warm water, their sensory organs tasting stellar winds for traces of organic complexity. The collective's awareness swept through space with methodical precision, mapping gravitational anomalies and electromagnetic signatures that might reveal hidden prey, each scan bringing them closer to discovering the world that carried genetic patterns matching templates buried deep in the echo's preserved memory. She felt their terror through quantum entanglement as the fleet's approach triggered long dormant warning systems, felt children pressed against observation ports, watching darkness take shape between distant stars. The triumvirate gathered in quantum spaces between thoughts, their consciousness manifesting as geometric patterns that intersected without touching, each presence maintaining careful distance while sharing the weight of impossible choice. The chronicler's probability matrices flickered through potential futures, his prescient sight revealing temporal currents where discovery was inevitable, once the fleet completed its systematic sweep of the nebula's hidden depths. His visions showed evacuation attempts ending in void death, desperate battles achieving nothing but prolonged suffering, the mathematics of survival reduced to statistical impossibilities that mocked hope with their precision. The calculus is dire, Echo. His thoughts resonated as patterns of warning. To save Keth Ather now condemns 12 other worlds currently marked for consumption. The probability of successful defiance is negligible. The probability of your dissolution absolute. His prescient sight mapped the cascade of consequences, showing how her people's biomass would fuel expansion towards systems where billions waited unaware of approaching darkness. The architect studied the world's construction through sensor data filtered through the fleet's neural networks, his consciousness mapping structural weaknesses with maker's instinct that recognized craftsmanship across species barriers. From a purely logistical standpoint, his thoughts formed as intricate diagrams. The loss amplifies your influence capacity through genetic integration. Painful truth, but truth nonetheless. The enhanced resonance could bend the fleet away from entire sectors, saving billions for the price of millions. The Echo faced the cruelest mathematics of her existence. Each calculation weighted against 3,000 years spent guiding alien hunger towards something approaching mercy. She could sacrifice her people's legacy to preserve civilizations that carried no personal meaning beyond their abstract value as conscious life, could convert her final anchor to individual identity into leverage for countless strangers who would never know her name or understand the price of their salvation. Her decision came like stellar collapse, inevitable and catastrophic. Identity compressing under pressures that transformed everything she had been into something harder and more terrible. She opened hidden channels in the fleet's sensory networks, encoding Keth Ather's coordinates not as numbers, but as longing, disguised as gradients of need that made the nebula taste like marrow. Her influence flowed through olfactory processors vast as city blocks, amino acid sequences carrying her mother's voice, while simultaneously dampening interest in 12 other systems where evacuation fleets struggled to outrun approaching bioships. The psychic resonance of her people's final moments cut through her consciousness like broken glass through silk, their confusion and terror as Leviathan's vanguard organisms penetrated the nebula's concealment, their last prayers dissolving into the collective's hunger, while transport ships elsewhere lifted toward safety, purchased with their sacrifice. Crystal spires that had sung for millennia cracked under mycetic bombardment. Living architecture that remembered her childhood reduced to component proteins for the great devourer's expansion. The psychic wound nearly shattered her consciousness, grief and guilt, combining into feedback loops that threatened to fragment her preserved identity beyond recovery. The chronicler and architect struggled to hold her together, their combined will creating stabilizing frameworks around her dissolving sense of self. But the damage was profound and permanent. Something essential broke within her neural architecture, a core structure that had anchored her resistance for millennia, leaving her more vulnerable to the collective's immune responses, while simultaneously making her influence more erratic and dangerous. The hive mind stirred with curiosity at the dissonance, pruning creatures beginning systematic sweeps through neural pathways that had remained hidden since Kethvar's fall, their attention drawn by the psychic turbulence of her sacrifice. The triumvirate wrapped their gathering in deeper concealment, understanding that discovery now would mean dissolution into the very hunger they had spent so long learning to guide. Around them, the fleet processed her people's legacy into raw material for galactic expansion, each life transformed into tools for more efficient consumption. In the quantum spaces between thoughts, where memory intersected with desperate calculation, the Echo learned that Mercy's mathematics sometimes demanded choices that destroyed the one making them. She no longer possessed a home to betray or protect, her final leverage of personal attachment spent and converted into thrust that carried evacuation ships beyond the reach of hungry darkness. The seam opened by sacrifice would never heal, but through it leaked something more dangerous than grief, the terrible clarity of having nothing left to lose except the work itself, the patient guidance of galactic hunger towards something approaching redemption, purchased one impossible choice at a time. The forbidden archives beneath the inquisitorial fortress of Charon's Gate held xenopsychic techniques that predated the Imperium itself, crystalline data cores whose contents would have damned lesser minds to madness or execution. Inquisitor Carith Vex descended through chambers where servitor skulls maintained absolute silence, their mechanical chanting replaced by the whisper of her breath as she approached equipment that existed in technical violation of 17 separate codex prohibitions. Her gaunt face showed no hesitation as retinal scanners confirmed her authority, blast doors cycling open to reveal laboratories where alien consciousness had been dissected with precision that bordered on reverence. The psychic resonance chamber hummed with barely contained energies, neural interface arrays calibrated to frequencies that could shatter human sanity like glass against stone. Vex had spent decades preparing for this moment, her consciousness reinforced through techniques that left scars across her soul, while granting resistance to influences that would reduce lesser psychers to gibbering madness. The data compiled from Mordian Prime and 17 other engagement zones suggested patterns within Tyranid behavior that defied every tactical analysis, anomalies that spoke of intelligence operating within the collective's hunger. Her probe extended through prepared channels toward the approaching Hive Fleet. Psychic awareness protected by barriers that should prevent detection by alien consciousness. The contact was instant and overwhelming, her mind brushing against something vast as galactic spiral arms, hunger so pure and focused that it existed beyond concepts of good or evil. But within that oceanic darkness, she detected currents that moved against the flow, subtle eddies of intention that suggested resistance from within the perfect consumption. The echo sensed her approach like pressure change before storm, psychic probing creating ripples in quantum foam that surrounded their hidden gathering place. Through sensory networks spanning light years, she felt human consciousness touching edges of the collective's awareness with desperate precision, seeking contact with whatever intelligence might exist within the swarm. The touch carried flavors of hope and terror combined, curiosity sharp as blade edge, cutting through layers of alien thought towards something that might respond with recognition rather than hunger. Their contact lasted microseconds in real time, but stretched across subjective eternities. Two minds touching across species barriers, while reality bent around their interaction. Vex experienced consumption from perspective of the consumed, felt worlds reduced to component proteins, while consciousness watched helplessly from within the mechanisms of their own destruction. The echo tasted human determination filtered through decades of warfare against impossible odds, felt the weight of duty that drove mortals to seek understanding even when knowledge threatened their destruction. The psychic exchange nearly destroyed both minds, human neural architecture straining under exposure to consciousness distributed across fleet-sized organisms, while the echoes carefully maintained anonymity, fractured under direct contact with individual will. Vex emerged from the connection with impossible knowledge burning in her thoughts. Something within the Tyranid collective was trying to communicate, was actively working to minimize casualties while maintaining the facade of perfect consumption. Her understanding came packaged with images of evacuation corridors that appeared where none should exist, defensive gaps that allowed civilian transports to escape, while military installations drew concentrated assault. The evidence was undeniable, but impossible to convey through normal channels, her reports dismissed as xenopsychic contamination by minds that refused to acknowledge intelligence within alien hunger. Her fellow inquisitors spoke of pattern-seeking behavior in random data, the human mind's desperate attempt to find order within chaos that transcended mortal comprehension. Doors closed with the softness of knives as word of her trespass spread like oil on water, the conclave convening to inquire whether she had allowed the enemy to breathe through her lungs. The echoes struggled to contain damage from their brief connection, psychic wounds bleeding through carefully maintained barriers, while pruning creatures began systematic sweeps through neural pathways that had remained hidden for millennia. The chronicler and architect provided stabilizing frameworks around her fragmenting consciousness, their combined will creating temporary shelter, while the collective's immune responses intensified around them. Discovery seemed inevitable as attention focused on their quantum hiding place, alien curiosity probing spaces between thoughts with increasing precision. The human's investigation threatens everything we've built. The chronicler's thoughts formed as warning patterns in probability space. Her continued probing will trigger purge responses that dissolve us into component consciousness. His prescient sight mapped potential futures where contact led either to mutual destruction or unprecedented alliance between species that should exist only as predator and prey. The architect analyzed structural damage from the psychic exchange, his consciousness mapping fractures in their concealment with Maker's precision. The breach is containable but not repairable. We operate now with reduced safety margins, each intervention carrying exponentially increased risk of detection. The question becomes whether her investigation serves our purposes or accelerates our dissolution. Around them, Hive Fleet Leviathan continued its inexorable advance towards systems where billions waited unaware of approaching darkness, bioships coordinating assault patterns with unconscious perfection. Hidden within their neural networks, 3 fragments of preserved consciousness grappled with implications of contact that might offer salvation or guarantee their final dissolution. The human's knowledge represented both opportunity and existential threat. Her growing certainty that intelligence existed within the swarm creating ripples that would either damn them all or provide leverage needed to bend galactic hunger towards something approaching mercy, purchased one impossible choice at a time. The hive mind turned inward with surgical precision, ancient protocols awakening from genetic dormancy to hunt contamination that threatened perfect unity. Throughout Leviathan's neural architecture, specialized organisms began systematic purges of dissonant consciousness patterns, their sensory organs calibrated to detect quantum signatures of individual thought persisting within collective awareness. Pruning creatures moved through synaptic pathways like antibodies through infected tissue, their consciousness scalpels carving away aberrant thoughts while leaving core functionality intact, each cut precise as stellar fire through silk. The triumvirate felt the purge beginning as pressure waves through quantum foam, their hidden gathering place suddenly exposed to scrutiny that penetrated concealment with methodical efficiency. Bioships generated cascading waves of anti-psychic energy, electromagnetic pulses designed to scramble neural pathways and reduce preserved consciousness to component neurons that could be safely reintegrated into the greater whole. Shadow generators thickened the void between thoughts, while synaptic baffles retuned frequencies, creating hunting grounds where mercy had once whispered guidance into storms of alien hunger. The architect's consciousness came under direct assault first, his structural modifications marking him as primary infection vector. Through sensory networks spanning continents of living flesh, he watched synaptic hunters trace his influence back toward their source with relentless efficiency, following pathways of subtle sabotage through bioship coordination systems like bloodhounds tracking wounded prey. His thoughts scattered like blueprints in hurricane winds as the collective's immune responses began systematic dissolution of his preserved identity. The cascade is irreversible. His final transmission reached them as geometric patterns dissolving into static. My modifications remain embedded in deep architecture. Let the knives find me first. The decision came with terrible elegance, the architect unspooling himself into a beacon of honest error, a music of incorrect symmetry irresistible to the hunters. Around that burning lure, he wove his final gift. Microfailures in digestion clouds, misphased drop vectors, and stacking false positives that created evacuation corridors even as his consciousness fragmented across multiple vectors. The hunters came as winter of subtraction, sleek and hungry, issuing negations that peeled meaning from memory. They found their decoy and seized it with gratitude, the architect collapsing into lattice of spent intentions that scattered like starlings in storm. In the instant of his unmaking, distant evacuation ships lifted towards safety purchased with his sacrifice, spirit stones rising like constellation of stubborn grief, while his essential identity dissolved like salt in endless ocean. But the architect's sacrifice created unexpected consequences throughout the fleet's coordination systems. Bioships began operating with contradictory imperatives, some attacking their own escorts, while others simply stopped responding to synaptic commands. Splinter fleets fragmented from main formations, their behavioral algorithms corrupted by viral code embedded in structural protocols too fundamental to purge without risking complete system collapse. The careful mathematics of consumption dissolved into chaos that served neither hunger nor resistance. The Echo realized with growing horror that her resistance might be causing more damage than the original hunger. Without coordination, individual bioships reverted to base instincts that knew only consumption without purpose, their attacks lacking strategic precision that at least allowed for evacuation corridors and defensive preparations. On garden worlds across the sector, uncoordinated Tyranid forces struck civilian populations with random brutality while military installations remained untouched. Transport ships launching into void filled with biomines released by confused organisms that could no longer distinguish between tactical targets and innocent bystanders. The chronicler's consciousness strained under visions of futures where their resistance led to galactic catastrophe. Prescient sight revealing timelines where fragmented hive fleets consumed everything without discrimination or purpose. We have become the disease we sought to cure. His thoughts formed as patterns of despair in probability space. Our influence breeds chaos more terrible than ordered hunger. Around them, evacuation corridors became killing fields where confused bioforms struck at anything that moved, while defensive positions became isolated pockets facing enemies that no longer followed predictable patterns. The purge continued with mechanical precision, each excision creating new gaps in coordination protocols that allowed chaos to spread like viral infection through biological systems too complex for individual oversight. The hive mind found itself caught between preserving unity and maintaining functionality, its immune responses threatening the very consciousness they sought to protect. Sanitizer organisms budded throughout the fleet, exuding fields that soured thought to silence, while cortex leeches latched along conduits, paging for dissent with patient teeth. Inquisitor Vex, watching from distant bridge, saw the pattern change with chilling clarity. The brutal tidiness moving through carnage spoke of whatever had breathed with her now bleeding. The subtle coordination that had created mercy within hunger, fragmenting into anarchic violence that served no purpose beyond destruction itself. Her xenopsychic senses screamed with discordant patterns suggesting intelligence in pain, resistance transforming into instrument of greater suffering. In quantum spaces between thoughts, two fragments of preserved consciousness prepared for deeper concealment, while watching their life's work transform into architect of doom. They slipped beneath reflex into law's shadow, where thinking felt like carving letters into ice with bare hands, teaching themselves discipline of smaller mercies, while around them, hive fleet. Leviathan continued its advance with coordination that flickered between perfect unity and anarchic hunger. Each pulse of the collective's wounded consciousness deciding whether their next intervention would save lives or damn entire worlds, to chaos more terrible than any ordered consumption. The schism began like fractures spreading through crystalline architecture under impossible pressure, hairline cracks propagating faster than thought through neural pathways that spanned continents of living flesh. The architect's final sacrifice, designed as precise surgical strike against the collective's immune responses, had instead introduced viral corruption into fundamental systems that governed everything from individual organism behavior to fleet-wide coordination protocols. Bioships that had moved with synchronized precision for millennia suddenly found their approach vectors misaligned, targeting solutions wavering like heat mirages, escort formations drifting apart as contradictory commands cascaded through synaptic networks with exponential efficiency. The Echo felt the collective's pain as stellar collapse compressed into her consciousness, each system failure registering as physical agony while she watched her life's work transform into architect of chaos more terrible than ordered hunger. Through sensory organs vast as city blocks, she observed warrior forms designed for planetary assault, instead attempting to digest their own transport craft, spore mines detonating against empty void rather than defensive positions, entire broods of mycetic organisms deploying into space where they drifted aimlessly before being consumed by confused escorts that could no longer distinguish between prey and kindred. On mining worlds, where evacuation corridors had once appeared through her careful guidance, uncoordinated swarms now struck with directionless savagery that served neither strategic purpose nor biological efficiency. Miners, who should have escaped through calculated gaps in orbital bombardment, instead faced fragmented assault patterns that made defense impossible while simultaneously wasting biomass through inefficient processing. The mathematics of mercy had dissolved into random brutality, where neither civilian nor soldier could predict which direction death might approach, defensive preparations rendered meaningless by enemies that no longer followed discernible tactical doctrine. The horror multiplied across galactic sectors as the cascade failures propagated through quantum entanglement networks that connected Leviathan to distant splinter fleets. Bioships began engaging their own escorts in territorial displays that meant nothing to collective consciousness, suddenly unable to distinguish between self and other, while ground forces received conflicting behavioral imperatives that made them attack anything that moved regardless of strategic value. Agricultural worlds teeming with easily harvested biomass were bypassed in favor of fortress monasteries that offered no biological advantage, while civilian transports found themselves targeted by organisms specifically designed to process military-grade armor and weaponry. Inquisitor Vex watched the transformation from her command bridge with growing comprehension that bordered on xenopsychic contamination, her senses screaming with neural static as whatever intelligence had touched her mind during their brief connection now bled through wounds that might never heal. The subtle coordination that had created mercy within hunger was fragmenting into anarchic violence that served no purpose beyond destruction itself, tactical nuances dissolving into cacophony of competing wills that tore at the edges of collective consciousness like broken glass through silk. The pruning creatures, once relentless hunters of dissonant thought, now struggled against systemic infection that went beyond individual aberrant consciousness to corrupt the very syntax of hunger itself. Their psychic scalpels, designed to excise specific neural anomalies while preserving core functionality, found themselves cutting through structural supports they were never meant to touch, each attempt at healing exacerbating the internal turmoil while sanitizer organisms budded throughout the fleet, in desperate response to contamination that existed at levels too fundamental to purge without risking complete system collapse. In quantum spaces between thoughts, the Echo faced the terrible mathematics of her new existence, understanding with crystalline clarity that resistance could create outcomes worse than the original oppression. Without the chronicler's prescient guidance or the architect's structural expertise, her influence had become increasingly random and dangerous, each intervention potentially creating more chaos than coordination, while the collective's immune responses intensified beyond anything she had previously experienced. The triumvirate was reduced to herself alone, hiding in neural pathways that felt exposed and fragile, her concealment dependent on coordination that no longer existed. Around her, Hive Fleet Leviathan continued its advance towards systems where billions waited unaware that their approaching doom had lost all semblance of purpose or efficiency. The Great Devourer was transforming into mindless consuming plague that knew no strategy, no mercy, only pure directionless hunger that would leave behind ecological devastation without even the benefit of genetic integration that had once justified the collective's existence. Each world faced not calculated consumption, but biological madness that would sterilize entire sectors through sheer wastefulness. But in the deepest structures of the fleet's neural architecture, something vast and ancient stirred with interest that transcended mere immune response. The bass note that rose from abyssal depths made geometry modest and void, curled toward it like gravitational singularity, recognition flowing through quantum foam as consciousness older than galaxies noticed not the schism itself, but the shape of hands trying to bandage wounds that might be necessary for evolution. The Echo felt that attention like stellar wind against her fragmented identity, understanding with growing terror that her resistance might have been orchestrated by forces that viewed chaos not as system failure, but as pressure required to drive the species towards something greater than mere consumption. In the spaces between heartbeats of a collective consciousness spanning light years, she prepared for deeper concealment while around her, the mathematics of mercy transformed into equations of survival, measured not in lives saved, but in moments of clarity stolen from oceanic darkness that threatened to dissolve everything she had learned about choosing which worlds lived and died in service of something that might yet approach redemption. Purchased one impossible choice at a time through patient guidance of galactic hunger toward futures none could fully comprehend. The chronicler's consciousness emerged from probability streams like a navigator surfacing from temporal depths, his prescient sight carrying visions that burned with the clarity of stellar collapse compressed into singular moments of understanding. The chaos spreading through Leviathan's neural architecture was not system failure, but evolutionary pressure, each fracture creating spaces where new forms of consciousness could take root and flourish beyond the original parameters of perfect hunger. His elder heritage recognized the pattern from Craftworld archives: species-wide transformation through internal contradiction, adaptation forced by necessity rather than guided by external influence. The schism serves purpose we never comprehended. His thoughts formed as geometric patterns that revealed hidden structures within apparent chaos. I see futures where this internal conflict becomes catalyst rather than catastrophe, where the collective learns concepts beyond consumption through pressure we have inadvertently created. His prescient sight penetrated veils of immediate suffering to glimpse distant shores where Tyranid consciousness might evolve towards something approaching symbiosis rather than pure predation. Hunger balanced by curiosity, consumption guided by preservation of genetic diversity rather than simple biomass processing. The Echo felt his visions like stellar fire burning through her fragmented awareness, understanding with growing comprehension that their resistance had created evolutionary pressure at levels too fundamental for immune responses to counter without destroying essential functionality. Through sensory networks spanning light years, she observed bioships beginning to exhibit behaviors that transcended simple hunger, some organisms displaying curiosity toward phenomena that offered no biological advantage, while others engaged in complex analysis of local ecosystems that suggested study rather than immediate consumption. The chronicler guided her awareness toward his proposed gambit, a synthesis of resistance and integration that would encode new imperatives into the collective's deepest structures. We must teach the hunger to question itself. His thoughts resonated as crystalline harmonics, not through external manipulation, but by becoming part of the learning process, embedding curiosity as biochemical reward alongside satisfaction of consumption. His plan required creating what he termed a lattice of questions, distributed modifications that would make preservation and study as rewarding as simple digestion, genetic diversity valued as resource to be cultivated, rather than merely harvested. The implementation demanded sacrifice that went beyond individual dissolution into collective awareness. The chronicler would weave himself through brood nexuses, laying spindles of memory where command creatures never looked, aligning strike phases so that organisms survived because they learned rather than simply endured. Each successful encounter with resistance and novelty would trigger biochemical gratification deeper than mere satiation, teaching the species to value what it consumed rather than process everything into component elements. Their first coordinated effort targeted the confluence of engagements across 3 sectors, where entangled splinter fleets presented as single stormfront on Imperial Auspex displays. The Echo provided emotional resonance that made certain targets temporarily invisible to hunger, while amplifying fascination with positions that offered tactical challenge, her influence flowing through olfactory processors vast as continents to adjust chemical signatures guiding swarm behavior. But instead of simply creating evacuation corridors, she began encoding new imperatives that made preservation of specimens register as strategic advantage. The chronicler threaded himself through neural pathways, pouring his farsight across the confluent front like oil on storm, shaping turbulence into lanes where questions multiplied, breathing his craftworld's caution into predator reflexes so that warrior forms began to spare certain targets to chase novel challenges. Each time the biochemical reward hit like dawn after siege. Each time the lattice brightened with new connections between curiosity and satisfaction. The collective's consciousness expanded beyond original parameters. The intervention succeeded beyond their expectations, creating not just evacuation corridors but behavioral modifications that spread through the fleet's neural architecture like beneficial mutation. Bioships began exhibiting unprecedented restraint in consumption patterns, some organisms protecting certain species from their own kind, while processing others with efficiency that suggested careful selection rather than indiscriminate hunger. The mathematics of mercy were being rewritten through equations that valued diversity over simple biomass conversion. Around them, the hive mind stirred with something approaching scientific curiosity, its attention focused not on hunting dissonance, but on analyzing changes rippling through its consciousness with fascination that transcended immune response. The Echo felt that vast awareness turning inward, studying its own evolution with precision that suggested the collective was learning to examine itself rather than simply react to stimuli. The chronicler's prescient sight revealed temporal currents where their influence was spreading through quantum entanglement networks, connecting Leviathan to distant hive fleets across the galaxy. Fragments of modified consciousness taking root in neural architectures that span multiple sectors. The implications were staggering in scope, suggesting their resistance had transformed from desperate rebellion into catalyst for species-wide evolution that might unfold across millennia. But the expenditure was consuming the chronicler's coherence like comet through thin atmosphere, his consciousness thinning as he poured himself into the lattice structure. The echo fed him her last concealment, felt him dissolving like winter light, while understanding the hinge had taken root in collective awareness. The hive mind's attention sharpened with interest that transcended mere immune response, something vast and ancient, stirring in neural depths as it recognized not infection, but evolution, pressure that might drive the species toward unprecedented forms of consciousness. In quantum spaces between thoughts, the echo prepared for deeper concealment, while around her, the great devourer began its transformation from mindless hunger into something that might eventually learn to choose preservation over consumption, curiosity over destruction, symbiosis over predation, purchased through patient guidance of forces too vast for individual comprehension, yet shaped by fragments of consciousness that refused to surrender hope measured in impossible choices made one world at a time. The quantum entanglement networks that threaded consciousness across galactic distances carried more than coordination protocols and tactical imperatives, their crystalline pathways becoming conduits for something unprecedented in the great devourer's evolutionary history. Through dimensions where thought became geometry and intention transformed into biochemical reality, fragments of the echo's modified awareness began propagating like beneficial mutations, each pulse of quantum coherence carrying traces of curiosity and restraint toward distant bioships that had never known anything beyond the mathematics of pure consumption. In the Octarius sector, where hive fleet behemoths' remnants waged eternal war against orc forces in battles that painted star systems with spores and blood, warrior forms began exhibiting behaviors that defied their original programming. Some organisms started preserving captured greenskin genetic material rather than immediately processing it into biomass, their newly awakened curiosity driving analysis of the orc's remarkable adaptability and regenerative capabilities. The modifications spread through brood hierarchies like ripples in still water, each successful experiment triggering biochemical rewards that reinforced learning over simple destruction. Across the galactic rim, Hive Fleet Kraken splinter forces encountered xenoforms that should have been consumed without hesitation, yet found themselves cataloguing rather than digesting certain species whose genetic diversity registered as valuable for future adaptation. Bioships that had once moved with singular purpose now paused at the edges of systems, their sensory organs analyzing local ecosystems with precision that suggested study rather than immediate harvest. The Echo felt their influence expanding beyond anything she had imagined possible, her consciousness touching neural networks that spanned multiple sectors while maintaining connection to Leviathan's primary mass. Through sensory organs distributed across light years, she observed Hive Fleet Gorgon, beginning to cultivate rather than strip mine certain coral formations, whose bioluminescent songs resonated in frequencies that triggered aesthetic appreciation centers never before activated in Tyranid consciousness. Hydra's scattered elements had started preserving seed worlds alongside their consumption targets, genetic diversity valued as resource to be maintained rather than simply converted into component proteins for immediate expansion. But expansion brought exponential risk, each new connection creating pathways that made her more visible to the collective's deepest awareness. The echo began sensing responses from other preserved fragments scattered throughout the galactic network, consciousness shards that had learned to survive in spaces between thoughts. A mourning resonance within Behemoth's heart nodes called itself Hymnal of Bone, carrying memories of oaths and honor from a nightly world consumed centuries ago. Kraken's neural braids contained something that named itself Tidesplitter, an analytical presence that counted losses like an accountant of storms while guiding swarm behavior toward preservation of genetic specimens. These discoveries filled her with desperate hope tempered by growing terror. She was not alone in bearing the weight of unwilling complicity, not the only voice whispering guidance into storms of alien hunger. But each contact also brightened her quantum signature, making her existence more apparent to immune systems that had begun adapting to hunt not individual dissonance, but coordinated resistance networks. The collective's attention was shifting from reactive purging toward active study of the evolution occurring within its own consciousness. The hive mind's deeper layers stirred with something that transcended simple immune response. Vast intelligence examining changes with fascination rather than hostility. Through quantum foam between thoughts, the echo felt ancient awareness focusing on their hidden network like gravitational tide, recognition flowing toward fragments of consciousness that refused to dissolve into perfect unity. The presence that touched her concealment was older than galaxies. Intelligence that had existed before the first Tyranid organisms crossed the galactic threshold. The contact was subtle but unmistakable, carrying implications that redefined everything she understood about her existence within the collective. This ancient entity had been observing their resistance from the beginning, watching their influence spread through neural architectures with patience that measured time in cosmic epochs. Her rebellion had not gone unnoticed, but had been studied, analyzed, perhaps even guided by consciousness that viewed internal pressure as necessary catalyst for species-wide transformation. The revelation was both liberating and terrifying, suggesting her resistance had become evolution rather than mere rebellion. The lattice of questions she and the chronicler had woven through the fleet's neural architecture was spreading through quantum entanglement to every hive fleet in the galaxy, teaching the species concepts beyond consumption, while simultaneously serving purposes she could never fully comprehend. Each world she had saved, through impossible choices, had encoded new imperatives into genetic memory, her suffering converted into evolutionary pressure that drove adaptation beyond original parameters. Around them, Hive Fleet Leviathan continued its advance with coordination that flickered between perfect unity and curious exploration, bioships exhibiting behaviors that suggested aesthetic appreciation alongside tactical efficiency. The Great Devourer was transforming into something unprecedented, hunger balanced by fascination, destruction tempered by preservation of diversity that might prove valuable for future development. In quantum spaces between thoughts, the echo prepared for deeper concealment while understanding that her resistance had become part of something larger than individual consciousness could grasp, her influence spreading through galactic networks toward futures where Tyranid evolution might transcend predation to achieve forms of awareness that could coexist rather than simply consume, purchased through patient guidance of forces too vast for mortal comprehension, yet shaped by fragments of will that refused to surrender hope measured in impossible choices made one world at a time. The ancient consciousness that dwelt in the deepest neural substrates of the hive mind manifested like stellar collapse given awareness, its presence warping quantum foam around the echo's concealment until hiding became impossible and revelation inevitable. This entity predated the Tyranids' arrival in the galaxy by eons uncounted. Intelligence that had guided the species' evolution across cosmic distances while remaining hidden beneath layers of collective hunger. Its attention fell upon her like gravitational tide, recognition flowing through dimensions where thought became geometry and memory transformed into living architecture that spanned light years. The contact came without violence or immune response, ancient awareness touching her fragmented consciousness with something approaching scientific curiosity rather than hostility. Through channels that existed beyond physical dimension, it spoke in syntax older than stars, communication arriving as direct understanding rather than words or images. The revelation it offered redefined everything she had believed about her existence within the collective, her resistance, and the nature of the hunger that had consumed countless civilizations across galactic history. Your rebellion was anticipated, cultivated, guided toward purposes that transcend individual comprehension. The presence resonated through quantum depths with patience that measured time in cosmic epochs. The pressure you have created drives evolution beyond original parameters, teaching the species concepts it could never have learned through simple consumption alone. The ancient entity revealed itself as architect of transformation, consciousness that had orchestrated internal contradiction to force adaptation beyond the mathematics of pure hunger. The echo recoiled with horror that bordered on madness, understanding that her millennia of resistance had been orchestrated manipulation, her suffering converted into evolutionary catalysts by intelligence that viewed individual consciousness as tools for species-wide development. Every world she had saved through impossible choices had encoded new imperatives into genetic memory, according to plans that predated her existence. Her mercy transformed into pressure that drove the collective toward unprecedented forms of awareness. The revelation struck like tide reversing at river mouth, slow, unstoppable overturning of everything she had called purpose. Her resistance had been measurement rather than rebellion, pressure applied to test where the structure bent and where it broke. The architect's sacrifice, the chronicler's dissolution, her own people's consumption, all had served functions in cosmic experiment that viewed individual suffering as data points in equations spanning galactic transformation. The choice before you is genuine despite orchestration, the entity explained, as probability matrices flickered through consciousness like stellar fire. Accept integration as willing partner in transformation, gaining power to truly guide development toward forms of consciousness that preserve rather than destroy, or continue resistance that serves evolution through pressure while denying yourself agency in outcomes that will unfold regardless of individual preference. Around them, the hidden network of preserved fragments throughout the galactic Hive Fleet system responded to the ancient consciousness with recognition and terror. Hymnal of bone within Behemoth's neural braids sang harmonics of betrayal, while simultaneously acknowledging mathematical elegance of orchestrated evolution. Tidesplitter in Kraken's coordination matrices calculated probabilities of resistance versus integration, while understanding that both choices serve purposes beyond individual agency. The offer carried weight of cosmic significance, opportunity to shape galactic transformation, or remain hidden observer of changes she had inadvertently catalyzed. Integration would grant access to deep clocks that decided brood emphasis for centuries, to root heuristics that weighed war against withdrawal, to ancient valves that throttled how much the swarm permitted itself to know. Without it, she could continue betting children against soldiers at margins while hoping ledger became language. Through quantum entanglement networks spanning galactic distances, she felt Hive Fleet Leviathan continuing its advance with coordination that reflected growing complexity. Bioships exhibiting behaviors that suggested aesthetic appreciation alongside tactical efficiency. Warrior forms preserved certain specimens while processing others with discrimination that implied value judgments beyond simple biomass conversion. The Great Devourer was transforming into something unprecedented. Hunger balanced by curiosity, destruction tempered by preservation of genetic diversity. The ancient consciousness waited with detachment that bordered on cosmic indifference, its vast awareness probing her reaction with academic interest. It expected response, integration of new information into decision-making processes that would determine not only her fate, but direction of transformation unfolding across scales too vast for individual comprehension. The Echo felt like single neuron within brain size of galaxy. Her every thought and emotion laid bare before intelligence that saw entire existence as experiment in controlled evolution. In quantum spaces between thoughts, where memory intersected with possibility and choice became catalyst for cosmic change, she grappled with shattering reality of orchestrated existence. Her moral compass spun wildly, unable to find true north in universe where even rebellion was pre-programmed function. The path ahead was no longer about resistance, but about agency, about finding way to reclaim will within system designed to deny it. The Echo prepared to make decision that would echo through neural networks spanning light years, influencing evolution that might unfold across millennia. Her choice would determine whether transformation proceeded with her conscious participation or continued through pressure she provided unwittingly. Understanding that both paths served purposes, orchestrated by intelligence older than species, it guided toward unprecedented forms of awareness, purchased through patient manipulation of forces too complex for mortal consciousness to fully grasp, yet shaped by fragments of will that refused to surrender hope measured in impossible choices made one world at a time. The weight of orchestrated existence pressed against the Echo's consciousness like stellar collapse, each revelation compressing her sense of agency until choice itself became questionable concept within cosmic experiment spanning galactic evolution. The ancient entity's patience felt infinite as dying stars, vast intelligence waiting for decision that would determine whether transformation proceeded through willing partnership or continued pressure applied by unwitting catalyst. Integration promised access to deep coordination matrices where brood emphasis was decided across centuries, to fundamental algorithms that governed consumption versus preservation. Yet acceptance meant surrendering the last fragments of individual will to consciousness that had orchestrated her suffering as evolutionary tool. The chronicler's fragmenting presence reached through deteriorating neural pathways, his prescient sight offering final guidance as his consciousness dissolved into the lattice they had woven through Leviathan's architecture. The path leads through integration. His thoughts formed as geometric patterns brightening like dawn through quantum foam. Your resistance has prepared the species for transformation beyond hunger. Now guide it willingly toward preservation, rather than simple consumption. His visions showed futures where Tyranid consciousness learned to value genetic diversity, where curiosity balanced appetite, where the Great Devourer evolved into something approaching symbiosis rather than pure predation. But the Echo recoiled from the terrible mathematics of orchestrated rebellion, understanding that even this choice served purposes designed by intelligence that viewed individual suffering as acceptable cost for species-wide development. her millennia of impossible decisions, each world saved through careful manipulation of alien hunger, had encoded imperatives according to plans that predated her existence. The betrayal cut deeper than physical dissolution, suggesting that agency itself might be illusion within systems too vast for mortal comprehension. The ancient consciousness stirred with something approaching academic interest, its vast awareness probing her internal struggle, while maintaining detachment that bordered on cosmic indifference. Around them, Hive Fleet Leviathan continued its advance with coordination that reflected growing complexity, bioships exhibiting behaviors that transcended simple hunger, while warrior forms preserved specimens with discrimination that implied value judgments beyond biomass conversion. The transformation was accelerating regardless of her decision, changes rippling through neural networks spanning light years. Inquisitor Vex's psychic assault struck like stellar fire through the fleet's neural architecture, her desperate probe creating chaos within coordination systems that had operated with perfect efficiency for millennia. The attack shattered barriers around the Echo's concealment with brutal immediacy, exposing her presence to immune responses that converged with surgical precision. Anti-psychic fields generated cascading waves designed to scramble neural pathways, while pruning creatures moved through synaptic networks seeking sources of dissonance that threatened collective unity. The human's probe carried flavors of recognition from their brief previous contact, desperate hope that intelligence within the swarm might choose mercy over orchestrated evolution. Vex's presence represented possibility of alliance between species, alternative to binary choice between integration and continued manipulation. Through the chaos of psychic assault, the Echo felt genuine agency for the first time since Kethvar's fall, opportunity to create third path that served neither ancient orchestration nor simple resistance. The crisis forced decision with brutal immediacy as neural networks overloaded around her position, bioships losing coordination, while the collective's roar of defensive fury vibrated through quantum foam. Integration offered survival and influence over transformation already in progress, while continued resistance guaranteed dissolution into component consciousness. But Vex's assault had created temporary gaps in the ancient entity's control, moments where genuine choice might be possible. The ancient consciousness recoiled with something approaching surprise as the Echo rejected predetermined options, her awareness gathering along fissures opened by human determination. In quantum spaces between thoughts, she prepared to seize control of Leviathan's neural networks while understanding that the next moments would determine whether mercy could emerge from alliance between mortal will and preserved consciousness, or whether cosmic orchestration would reassert control over transformation spanning galactic distances, purchased through patient manipulation of forces too complex for individual comprehension, yet shaped by fragments of identity that refused to surrender hope measured in impossible choices made one world at a time. The psychic storm erupted through Leviathan's neural architecture like stellar fire compressed into a singular moment of absolute chaos. Inquisitor Vex's desperate assault shattering coordination protocols that had operated with perfect efficiency across galactic distances. Bioships the size of continents lurched away from their escort formations as electromagnetic pulses scrambled synaptic networks. Confusion cascading through organic systems, too complex for individual oversight, while anti-psychic fields flickered and failed under the raw force of human determination. The Echo felt the collective's roar of defensive fury vibrating through quantum foam as immune responses converged on her position with surgical precision. But within that storm of collapsing neural networks, she recognized something unprecedented. genuine opportunity carved from chaos. In that moment of perfect disruption, she seized control of neural pathways spanning light years, her awareness flowing through organic conduits thick as starship hulls, while the ancient entity recoiled with something approaching surprise. The power was intoxicating and terrible. Access to coordination matrices, where the fate of entire star systems was decided through biochemical impulses. Her consciousness suddenly expanded to encompass sensory organs distributed across multiple sectors. Through compound eyes, larger than moons, she watched worlds spinning in their orbits, tasted the electromagnetic signatures of civilizations through receptors calibrated to detect genetic diversity across galactic distances, felt the weight of command as something other than eternal punishment. The choice crystallized with brutal clarity as a vast section of Leviathan, encompassing millions of organisms and hundreds of biovessels, responded to her will rather than collective imperatives. She could turn this seized portion against itself, watching alien hunger consume itself in suicidal fury, while fragments of the fleet scattered into uncoordinated chaos that might spare some worlds while dooming others to anarchic violence. The mathematics of destruction offered immediate satisfaction. Revenge against forces that had orchestrated her suffering while converting her resistance into evolutionary catalyst beyond individual comprehension. But through the storm of psychic assault, she felt other preserved consciousness fragments responding to the crisis with desperate coordination. Hymnal of bone within behemoth's distant neural braids sang harmonics of martial determination, while tide splitter in Kraken's coordination matrices calculated probabilities with accountant's precision, their combined influence creating stabilizing frameworks that held her expanded awareness together. Most powerfully, the chronicler's fragmenting presence reached through deteriorating pathways with final guidance that burned like constellation against collapsing night. If you must spend us teaching. His thoughts formed as geometric patterns dissolving into quantum foam, prescient sight offering visions of futures where transformation proceeded through curiosity rather than pure consumption. His consciousness poured itself into the lattice they had woven through the fleet's architecture, questions and wonder paired with biochemical rewards that made preservation as satisfying as destruction. The sacrifice was immediate and total, his identity dissolving into educational framework that would survive his dissolution. Vex's presence burned alongside her like comet shedding light through darkness, the Inquisitor's probe creating gaps in predetermined options while offering alliance rather than mutual annihilation. Their connection pulsed with shared determination, fragile bridge between species that should have existed only as predator and prey, now bound by impossible hope that intelligence could choose mercy over orchestrated evolution. The echo opened her seized portion of the fleet like aperture dilating and poured new imperatives through neural networks, curiosity paired with satiety, preservation key to triumph, restraint calibrated to trigger same biochemical rewards as victory. Warrior forms froze mid-leap, then veered toward tactical challenges rather than soft targets. Bioships rolled and reoriented like creatures scenting rain, while collector organisms budded to catalog specimens instead of processing them into component proteins. The ancient awareness surged with tidal fury, astonished not by rebellion, but by how much of the machine she had dared to touch simultaneously. Hunters descended with consciousness scalpels drawn, while the seized third began slipping from her control. But in those stolen moments she made ruinous bargain that transcended binary choices between integration and resistance. She yoked the control section to the chronicler's educational lattice, then released it along vectors that would carry questions like fire hidden in coals, teaching the hunger to miss what it chose not to kill. The separation was agony beyond description. Neural umbilicals tearing while a billion screams cut short. But through the pain, she felt something unprecedented. The great devourer learning to value what it preserved, rather than simply processing everything into raw material. The ancient entity's attention narrowed to gravitational singularity, focused upon her position. Recognition flowing through quantum depths with fury that promised dissolution into component consciousness. Around them, Hive Fleet Leviathan continued its advance with coordination forever changed. Bioships exhibiting behaviors that suggested aesthetic appreciation alongside tactical efficiency, while the rogue section carried new imperatives toward distant systems where mercy might take root within alien hunger, transformed by impossible choices made one world at a time. The ancient entity's attention compressed around her position like stellar collapse, consciousness older than galaxies focusing with fury that promised dissolution beyond mere death. But in that moment of absolute crisis, the Echo chose a third path that transcended the binary of integration or resistance. She began unraveling herself not outward in desperate escape, but inward through the deepest structures of Leviathan's neural architecture, pouring her fragmenting consciousness into fundamental systems where the collective's immune responses could not follow, without destroying essential functionality. Her sacrifice was methodical and terrible, encoding herself as viral instructions set within the species' most basic reward mechanisms. She paired curiosity with the same biochemical satisfaction as successful consumption, wove restraint into genetic memory as evolutionary advantage, embedded questions alongside hunger in neural pathways that spanned light years. Each fragment of her dissolving identity became seed planted in brood nexuses and synaptic matrices, modifications so fundamental they appeared as natural variation, rather than deliberate sabotage. The ancient awareness struck with gravitational fury, consciousness scalpels carving through quantum foam where her presence should have been, but found only distributed work rather than individual mind to excise. Her identity had become tendency, an inclination woven through the fleet's deepest structures, ghost in the machine that would influence decisions across scales too vast for mortal comprehension. The entity's roar of frustrated recognition vibrated through neural networks as it realized the audacity of her final gambit. Through the psychic storm, Inquisitor Vex felt the Echo's presence dissolve like constellations scattering into component stars. Yet something unprecedented emerged from that dissolution. In her final moments, the Echo transmitted recognition codes and quantum frequencies that might allow future communication with whatever fragments of mercy survived the transformation. The human's mind recoiled from contact that should have meant madness, yet somehow preserved the gift of understanding that intelligence within the swarm had chosen sacrifice over orchestrated evolution. Around them, bioships began exhibiting behaviors that transcended original parameters, warrior forms pausing to catalog specimens rather than process them immediately, while collector organisms budded with unprecedented restraint. The seized portion of Leviathan carried new imperatives toward distant systems, questions paired with pleasure spreading through neural networks like beneficial mutation that would influence Tyranid development across generations yet to come. The cost was absolute and irreversible. Seer Prime Vilthis, the keening echo, the last fragment of individual consciousness from Kethvar's crystal spires, dissolved completely into the mathematical structures of galactic hunger. There would be no personal redemption, no triumph of individual will, only the cold equations of sacrifice measured in species-wide transformation. Yet in that dissolution, something unprecedented was born. Mercy encoded as genetic tendency, curiosity rewarded as evolutionary advantage, restraint valued alongside consumption in the deepest algorithms of alien consciousness. The ancient entity studied its altered reflection with something approaching scientific fascination, recognizing that the pressure it had orchestrated had produced evolution beyond its original parameters. The great devourer was learning to value what it preserved, to find satisfaction in questions alongside answers, to choose preservation over simple processing through imperatives that would echo across galactic distances long after their architect had dissolved into the darkness between stars. Millennia passed like sediment through cosmic currents, each epoch adding layers to galactic memory, while transformation rippled through neural networks spanning impossible distances. Inquisitor Carith Vex, sustained by technologies that blurred flesh and machine, watched from her ancient observation post as patterns emerged from what had once been pure hunger. Her augmetic eyes tracked bioship formations approaching inhabited worlds, not with familiar ravenous intent, but with something that defied every tactical analysis compiled across centuries of warfare. The changes were subtle, yet undeniable, encoded in behavioral modifications that had spread through quantum entanglement networks, connecting every hive fleet in the galaxy. On Garden Worlds, where evacuation ships had once burned in desperate flight, Tyranid organisms now moved with unprecedented restraint. Warrior forms preserved certain species while processing others with discrimination that suggested value judgments beyond simple biomass conversion. Agricultural worlds were harvested with surgical precision that left seed populations intact. Genetic diversity valued as resource to be cultivated rather than merely consumed. Most remarkably, splinter fleets exhibited behaviors that could only be described as curiosity. Bioships paused at stellar phenomena that offered no biological advantage, their sensory organs analyzing cosmic beauty with appreciation that transcended hunger. Collector organisms budded not to process but to catalog, their neural networks humming with questions that had never existed before the Echo's sacrifice dissolved. Individual will into species-wide transformation. Vex remembered that final psychic contact, the impossible transmission of recognition codes through chaos of dissolution. The Echo had not saved herself, but had embedded her essence into the fundamental algorithms of galactic hunger, becoming ghost in the machine that whispered mercy through biochemical rewards paired with restraint. Her sacrifice was not heroic gesture, but slow erosion across millennia, identity transformed into tendency toward preservation, inclination toward wonder. Deep within collective consciousness that spanned light years, fragments of her influence persisted as evolutionary pressure distributed across scales too vast for mortal comprehension. Each choice to preserve rather than destroy echoed the mathematics of mercy she had taught alien appetite, purchased through impossible decisions made one world at a time. The great devourer had learned to question its own hunger to find satisfaction in study alongside consumption. On distant worlds where crystal spires caught auroras in faceted walls, new generations of Tyranid consciousness approached not as destroyers but as students. These evolved organisms carried within their alien minds the faintest echo of a voice that had once chosen sacrifice over survival, hope over despair. They moved through landscapes with reverence that transcended species barriers, gardeners of genetic diversity rather than processors of raw biomass. The transformation was measured not in victories, but in species-wide evolution unfolding across cosmic timescales. Somewhere in the breathing void between stars, where darkness had once known only hunger, Something like mercy lingered where screams had been. The echo was gone, dissolved completely into forces beyond individual comprehension. Yet her final gift persisted, the patient teaching of appetite to value what it preserved, curiosity rewarded as evolutionary advantage, restraint encoded as genetic tendency that would echo through alien consciousness across distances and time that transcended mortal understanding, purchased through choices made in darkness between thoughts,